Immediately after taking off from San Diego, Delta Airlines Flight 1080 is faced with a harrowing situation. Stuck in an abnormally high pitch, Flight 1080 risks stalling into the Pacific. How did Flight 1080 get stuck, and how will the pilot safely land the plane? On the evening of April 12, 1977, Delta Airlines Flight 1080 is boarding at San Diego, preparing for a flight to Atlanta, stopping over at 3 other cities before arriving at Atlanta. The aircraft being used for Flight 1080 is a nearly 3-year-old Lockheed L-1011-1 registered as November 707 Delta Alpha, for having its first flight in May 5, 1974, before being delivered to Delta only 3 weeks later on May 24, 1974. On board Flight 1080, the plane was piloted by 56-year-old Captain Jack McMahon, First Officer Wilbur Radford, and Flight Engineer Stephen Hyde. Along with the 3 pilots are 8 cabin crew members handling 41 passengers for a total of 52 people on board Flight 1080. April 12, 1977. Nearing midnight at San Diego International Airport, Delta Airlines Flight 1080 is boarding their 41 passengers and preparing for a flight to Atlanta with a 3-stop itinerary at Los Angeles, Dallas, and New Orleans before arriving in Atlanta. The weather conditions around San Diego and Los Angeles had moderate visibility, but a cloud deck was approaching in from the coast, with the visibility gradually getting worse. Flight 1080 took off from San Diego at 11:53 p.m. local time, heading westward towards the Pacific Ocean. As soon as Flight 1080 lifted off from the runway, the plane abruptly pitched up higher than what was normal. At that point, it was still controllable. Captain McMahon pushed the control column down and set the nose pitch at 3.5 degrees. With the normal 15-degree climb pitch being re-established, the plane's gear was put up. Around 400 feet, Flight 1080 continued pitching up, reaching around 18 degrees, with the controls getting sluggish as Captain McMahon attempted to use the mechanical trim to force the plane to pitch down. Flight 1080 started turning north towards Los Angeles as they reached 800 feet, with Captain McMahon attempting to reset all the switches for the plane's trim and pitch, but to no effect. They continued climbing to 3,000 feet, still at an abnormally high pitch, having exhausted all emergency protocols for the matter. They informed San Diego Control that they were having a pitch problem. The plane continued climbing across to 4,500 feet, with their pitch going all the way to 22 degrees, even when the pilots are now applying full force in an attempt to push the nose down. Their airspeed continued to lower down to 138 knots, getting dangerously close to entering a stall. Because of that, the plane also started to roll a little bit as they continued to decrease in airspeed. The pilots then, in a stroke of clarity over the situation, decreased throttle on all 3 engines except engine 2 in an attempt to decrease their pitch gain. By decreasing the throttle on the wing engines and increasing the throttle on engine 2, which was located on the back of the plane, the thrust from engine 2 would act to push the plane down, which would help them gain a little bit of control. After this, their pitch went down to 18 degrees and they slowly started going back up after they reached 150 knots, since the flaps were giving them more control while the plane was still at a very low speed. Captain McMahon and First Officer Radford were still pushing down on the control column so the plane doesn't back up, just in case. The plane climbed over 9,000 feet, breaking out of the overcast towards the mainly clear sky. They were told by the control center to maintain around 11,000 to 12,000 feet. But with the plane's absurd pitch, they continued climbing all the way to 14,000 feet, where Captain McMahon had to throttle down engine 1 to 3 to decrease their climb rate. They had to adjust their throttle again and again as the plane kept wavering above and below 10,000 feet until they managed to finally stabilize it. The pilots informed the flight attendants of the situation, and in an effort to move the plane's center of gravity forward, which would help decrease their pitch even further, all of the plane's passengers were moved towards the front end of the plane to add more weight, further reducing their pitch. By then, the pilots were halfway between Los Angeles and San Diego, which at a time had heavy overcast and terrible visibility. They considered Phoenix and Las Vegas as emergency airports, but considering that they were stuck at 11,000 feet, they were at risk of hitting terrain or losing control in turbulence since they couldn't go up or they would risk stalling the plane, which means that if they were to lose control due to turbulence, they would have very few altitude to recover. They had no choice but to proceed toward Los Angeles since San Diego had the worst weather conditions out of both of them. So Los Angeles was their best, or I guess least worst choice. They contacted Los Angeles Control, declaring an emergency and informing them of their situation. Flight 1080 went for an overwater approach since if they ever lose control, at least they wouldn't crash into the residential areas of Los Angeles. As the plane started going into approach, the plane entered the overcast again and the pilots went one step at a time, putting their flaps down incrementally so they don't overcorrect their pitch and crash down. They continued incrementally putting their flaps down, correcting any pitches as they went down across the cloud layer towards the airport. As they reached 2,500 feet, they put the gear down, but the plane immediately pitched up. The pilots attempted to push the control column down in an attempt to fix the pitch maneuver, but the plane had continued pitching up, and for a split second, they considered turning around and just ditching the plane on the ocean if needed. But thankfully, they had used the throttle to force the plane down, increasing thrust on engine 2 to reduce their pitch as mentioned before. And it worked. Flight 1080 broke the cloud layer at 700 feet and had visual contact at Los Angeles International Airport. They touched down around 12:48 AM and the pilots deployed reverse thrust on engines 1 and 3, putting engine 2 on idle since deploying reverse thrust on engine 2 risks pitching the nose up and causing a tail strike. Flight 1080 managed to slow down to a safe speed with all 52 occupants safe and on the ground 55 minutes after the entire ordeal began. After Flight 1080 landed, they taxied out of runway 6 right via taxiway 47 towards the ramp. The passengers and crew disembarked the plane where they saw the aircraft's left elevator jammed up. In aircraft, the elevator is the leading edge on the plane's horizontal stabilizer on the back of the plane, with the elevators mainly being used to control the aircraft's pitch. On Flight 80, they were jammed up, which led to the plane getting stuck on high pitch nearly the entire flight. After the aircraft parked and everyone disembarked, engineers from Lockheed and the FAA swarmed the L-1011 to start investigating into Flight 1080. The investigation was made by the American Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA for short. They found that the bearing inside the elevator was extremely corroded, which caused it to jam. As the plane pressurized and depressurized over thousands of flight cycles, the pressure sucked in water into the structure, causing the bearings to corrode and jam. Lockheed and the FAA issued an emergency airworthiness directive to tell airlines to check the stabilizer's bearing to see if they had corroded, with several aircraft having bearings covered in water and starting to corrode. The corroded bearings, when Captain McMahon pulled the aircraft as it took off, had jammed into position, which led to the aforementioned uncontrollable pitch movement. Even after the airworthiness directive issued by the FAA, which prompted airlines to check the bearings of their L-1011 aircraft, only a few months later, on June 5, 1977, a British Airways L-1011 experienced a jammed elevator, albeit less severe than what happened on Flight 1080. The flight successfully did an emergency landing in Barcelona. After this incident, the FAA made it mandatory before takeoff for pilots to perform a visual check on the elevator before takeoff. Lockheed also added a deflector near the bearing to drain away water to lessen the chances of corrosion, a seal around the bearing keeping water and grease away from the bearing, and also remade the bearing in and of itself to add redundancies. So if the bearing fails or jams again, it shouldn't cause a severe emergency like on Flight 1080. The L-1011 used in the accident November 707 Delta Alpha was put back into service operating for Delta until 1985, where it was transferred to American Transair until it was scrapped back in 2002. Captain McMahon received the FAA's Distinguished Service Award for his skill in landing the aircraft. Along with that, First Officer Radford and Flight Engineer Hyde received FAA certificates of commendation. Delta Airlines Flight 1080 was crippled beyond belief, and with the skill of these 3 pilots, were able to save the 49 people on board the plane. A true example of skill and confidence in spite of the situation. Hey guys, sorry this took a while. I've been busy with schoolwork and all that stuff, But hopefully the next episode shouldn't take that long. I am gonna be animating it, so perhaps. Anyways, that's it for now. Hope you enjoyed. Bye!